All right. Thank you guys so much for coming. Welcome to P&T Knitwear. It is really exciting to have someone like Lina Khan, who is, blazing a trail in a lot of different ways, and just incredibly grateful that she came to talk to us. A few things to mention. One is we are recording this also for our podcast called Firewall. It'll come out tomorrow, so if you say anything really loud, you'll get captured in the background, so that could be good or bad depending on how you see it. I'm going to ask Lina questions for about half an hour. We're going to turn over to the audience. I think you've got like a hard stop at 7:15, so we will use the time as wisely as we can. So anyway, thank you for coming.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here. I think this is the first time I've done an event at a bookstore, so FTC's cred, I think, is street cred is
we're
up there
breaking
now.
new ground here. Well, so I have to say, I was surprised at the number of people who wanted to come to this and like the interest in it. And so clearly people are watching what you're doing. So from your perspective, why does the FTC matter?
So the FTC has been around since 1914. This was an agency that was created, during the first Gilded Age against the backdrop of the robber barons and, the sugar trust, the meat trust. And Congress created the agency because it worried about the concentration of economic power that they believed was inhibiting democracy, inhibiting liberty, making it difficult for people to go out and compete on the merits of their products and services. And they thought that an economy where you had fair competition was really central to our democracy. That in the same way that we needed to prevent concentration of power in our political sphere, that Congress believed we also needed to prevent concentration of economic power in our commercial sphere in order to fully have robust, thriving democracy and liberty. So that's really the backdrop of the agency. Since then, our authorities have been expanded to include consumer protection. And today, we're really on the front lines of a lot of the biggest challenges that our people are facing in their day-to-day lives, be it unaffordable drug prices, be it infant formula shortages, be it huge data security hacks. The FTC is really in the trenches on protecting Americans from unlawful business practices, and so it's an exciting time.
So you guys cover, as you just mentioned, kind of a really wide variety of industries. Tech seems to capture the lion's share of attention of the work that you're doing, and obviously the potential breaking up of really big tech is something that people, I think, if you ask people, Lina Khan, that's kind of what they say, right? She's going to break up Google or Apple or whatever it is. And there's a little bit, I think we actually had lunch today with a bunch of VCs, and I think you even saw it in the room a little bit, which is even though early stage tech and Google have as much in common as this microphone and this book does, there's sort of this defensive, oh, we have to protect tech from regulation. But I would argue, and the reason that I've kind of been publicly supportive is, as an early stage investor, I can't invest in a potential competitor to Google or Meta or Apple because they're just going to squash them and they have too much monopolistic power to prevent it. So there seems like there's almost this cognitive dissonance where I would argue that the work that you guys are doing is really necessary to make the economy and innovation and business succeed once these big companies eventually get stagnant like they all do. And yet sort of the narrative is kind of the opposite of it. So one is, what's the reality of all of it? Why are you doing it? And then two, why do you think people don't understand it properly?
So look, one reason why Congress decided that they want our economy to be competitive and dynamic is because there's no monopoly on good ideas, right? We really want an economy and markets where if somebody has a good idea, they're able to secure financing for it. You want them to be able to bring it to market and really compete on the merits. And so you want their success to be based on whether the product or service is popular, whether it's good for consumers, and not on whether they're getting the right permission from the existing giants or whether the existing giants do or don't feel threatened by them. And so that's really what our work is about. We're trying to enforce fair competition laws, antitrust laws that are trying to crack down on anti-competitive practices like coercion and illegal mergers that are stifling competition and really preventing those types of innovative ideas from coming to the market. And I think, business dynamism really suffers when you see those types of anti-competitive practices, and that's what we're really trying to push back against.
And are we in a new, unprecedented era of really like a handful of incredibly powerful companies with these trillion-dollar valuations, or ultimately do we see this every generation and it happens to now be tech platforms as opposed to railroads or oil companies, whatever?
Yeah, it's a great question. And look, I think in some ways the railroads really set the foundations for the types of dynamics that we're seeing today, where you had this phenomenal technology that was suddenly connecting the country, enabling farmers in New York to suddenly get their goods all the way to California. But you also had a lot of consolidation, so that these amazing technologies were now controlled by a relatively few number of entities. And that meant that those entities could really pick winners and losers, right? They could decide who got access to the railroad, who didn't. Their decisions were sometimes, discriminatory based on who was cutting them special favors, who didn't threaten them in their other business lines. And Congress decided that, this was unfair. It was really distorting the economy. It was creating a situation where who was succeeding and who was losing was not based on how good their ideas were, how good their products were. And I think similarly today, in digital markets, we see gatekeepers that are controlling access to key markets. And I think similarly, we hear a lot of concerns from small businesses, from entrepreneurs, from merchants that are concerned that, their livelihood and their ability to succeed in the market is not a function of whether consumers like their products. It's a function of whether the existing giants are going to give them access. And I think that's where you start seeing some of those distortions.
So now as we move into a world of Web3, and then we'll get into AI, do those distortions become even sort of more critical and problematic, or is it again just always a kind of thing where any time that a couple companies have a stranglehold on a really critical good, you've got to sort of at least look at it, if not act on it?
Yeah, look, I think there are key analogies, but there are also key differences, right? I think in digital markets, we've seen how, there are network externalities, but there are also huge reinforcing advantages to data, right? That means that whoever gets an early head start and is able to lock in their dominance, there's a huge amount of data that's going to keep feeding into them and allow them to expand into other lines of business. What that means is that, from an enforcement perspective, we need to be very vigilant early. I think there was a sense in the early 2000s that these digital markets are so fast moving, and so if anything, enforcers and regulators really need to step back and allow the market to just do what it's going to do, because even if you were ever to have monopoly power, there was always going to be so much entry and dynamism that that monopoly power would be dissipated away. And I think what we've seen, in fact, is the exact opposite. That in digital markets in particular, you have these dynamics that can lead markets to tip, that can lead to lock-in. And so if anything, you need to be especially vigilant on the front end because it's much more difficult to solve these problems after you've had illegal mergers or anti-competitive practices that have gone unaddressed for a long time.
All right, so let's jump into the thing that I think most people here actually definitely want to hear about, which is AI. So you had an op-ed in the Times last week, 2 weeks ago, something like that, kind of laying out both your, I think kind of in some ways the first intellectual framework for how to think about regulating AI was kind of how I read the piece. So give us the strokes of I'm going to make you king now, right? So you're not just the FTC chair, but you control Congress, the White House, everything. How should we regulate AI?
So the goal of the article was to really clarify a misconception. And I think that misconception is that here's AI, it's this new thing, and it's really emerging in this regulatory vacuum, right? I think a lot of the statements that we see from some of the executives also try to ratify this idea. This is new, there are no rules, Congress, please create some rules. And what we thought it was really important to do was to clarify that, hey, there are actually all these existing rules on the books that are all gonna apply. Right? There's no AI exemption from laws prohibiting discrimination. There's no AI exemption from laws prohibiting collusion. And so it was really an effort to make clear that just because businesses may be using these tools and introducing them, they need to make sure that they're already complying with the existing laws on the books. I think we already see a lot of risks relating to how these tools can be used to turbocharge fraud and scams, which, it might seem less exciting than some of the dystopian visions we hear about, but in terms of the very real dangers here and now, it's off the charts, right? I mean, these are tools that are basically enabling scammers and fraudsters to disseminate fake content much more cheaply, much more quickly, and a much wider scale. And so we've already heard stories about how bad actors can use voice cloning tools to make calls, pretend to be somebody's family member in distress using a very convincing simulation, and scam people out of thousands of dollars, right? And so those types of urgent, immediate, here and now type harms are the ones that we at the FTC are most concerned about. I think on the competition side, there are a whole set of really interesting questions to be asked around, what is the stack of AI? What are the different inputs, right? So you have compute, you have cloud, you have data, you have the models layer, you have the applications layer. Which of those layers are ones where we are likely to see significant benefits to scale and some of the existing giants having an advantage, and how do we make sure that they're not using that advantage to squash out competition and say, certain types of applications or models. So I think that's where we need to be quite vigilant.
So one way to interpret what you just said is it was almost a hedge against the risk of government not really acting. You're saying, look, even if there's no new kind of regulatory framework, the tools already exist to do our job. When I talk to founders who are in the AI space, they all believe that regulation is coming, and yet we haven't regulated Internet 2.0 yet, right? There's no GDPR in the US. Section 230 is somehow still alive and well. So how confident are you that Congress or states or others will really act on this, and how much do you think it's just going to need to be like, hey, the existing tools are here, that's what you have to rely on?
I mean, at the FTC, we're really focused on using our existing tools, especially when we see the types of harms that are clearly in our jurisdiction. Over the last decade, we've seen a lot of really interesting activity at the state level, where we've seen state-level privacy laws. We've also seen a whole set of initiatives to limit, or in some cases ban, the use of facial recognition technology. And so I think that state-level activity will continue to be really important at the local level, where some of this stuff can get done, especially as these tools get more and more incorporated into how key decisions are being made about who's getting access to health services, who's getting access to housing. As this stuff becomes more embedded in just how daily decisions are being made, I think they invite and merit a lot of scrutiny. I think we've already seen how there's an enormous amount of data being fed into these machines, and there are very few checks on what type of information is being fed. And so if that information is riddled with errors or riddled with bias, you can see enormously consequential decisions for people's lives being made, potentially based on erroneous information, right? There's already reporting around how people are being sent to jail based on some of this information. So I think that the problems and concerns are quite urgent, and I think enforcers, be it at the state level or national level, are going to be acting.
So on antitrust, you seem to have the one issue that actually allows both parties to work together, right? Like, remarkably, bills move, they come out of committee, they get on the floor, you've got bipartisan support. So is it that you have sort of just the unicorn issue, or are there things that you've seen, as obviously you're talking to members and everything else that happens, are there lessons from that we could apply to other issues so that we can get a little more bipartisan cooperation on other stuff?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I do think that antitrust and anti-monopoly is somewhat unique, perhaps, because it really stems from a concern about concentration of power, right? And how excessive concentration of power can really threaten core fundamental democratic values, can threaten core liberties. And I think, traditionally among conservatives, we've seen a lot of concern about concentration of state power. But I think there's a growing recognition that when you have concentration of private power among entities that are making enormously consequential decisions about who gets to be heard in the public sphere, that type of private power can start functioning like government power in some ways. And so I think the recognition around that is really what's facilitating this type of bipartisan coalition, which I think is enormously exciting. I do think we see similar types of bipartisan concern around data privacy issues, endless surveillance of people, the fact that you have to surrender your key core sensitive data in order to use apps and services that are increasingly essential for navigating day-to-day life. Similarly, we've traditionally seen concerns among conservatives about the surveillance state. The more you see how private surveillance and public surveillance can kind of go hand in hand, I think you see similar coalitions. Concern around kids' privacy in particular is an area where I think we've seen a lot of legislative activity as well.
So Washington, I think we have this, all of America, right? If you said, what's Washington? A mess would be just basically the common answer. Now that you're in there under the hood and sort of dealing with people both in public but also in private, I mean, how bad is it, and how much is the stereotype like the reality of it, and how much is it just sort of the press sort of making things more exciting than they are?
Look, I mean, at the FTC, this is an agency that's been around for 100+ years. There are a lot of challenges, one of which is just resources. So the FTC today is smaller than it was in the late 1970s. Meanwhile, our economy has grown, 6 to 8 times as much. And so one of the realities for us that was really eye-opening for me when I got in there was just we're having to do triage every day, all the time, basically, where it's like we see activity here, we see problematic activity there, and just how you prioritize and how you determine where to actually be putting resources is something we're having to just decide every day, day in, day out, in really tough ways. I mean, I think there are a lot of problematic business practices that we see that we wish we had more resources to be able to address.
Non-compete. So you guys have moved some pretty substantial rules forward, really that I think would change the way that non-competes are done, or maybe that they exist at all. What'd you do? Why'd you do it? And what's the path ahead for it?
So I'm really excited about this work. In January, the FTC proposed a rule that would eliminate the use of non-competes in employment contracts. And we did this for a couple of reasons. One of which is, there have been some states like, say, California, which now for many, many, many decades have rendered non-competes non-enforceable. But in the last decade plus, we've actually seen more and more states take some action against non-competes, either to limit them or to prohibit them. And what that has done is basically created a natural experiment among states that allow researchers to really isolate the effects of non-competes, where they basically can compare what are the effects on local economies when you do have non-competes or where you don't have non-competes, what is the effect on specific sectors. And so now there's actually a pretty robust set of empirical research showing that non-competes have an effect on lowering workers' wages, but they also have an effect on competition. They have an effect on innovation, where oftentimes, the people who are best positioned to go start up a new business are the, people already working at one of these companies. And when they're locked into a non-compete, that can really inhibit new business formation and innovation. We've also just frankly seen a proliferation of how these non-compete clauses are being used. So they started in the boardroom, started with high-level executives, but they really have now spread across the economy, be it, janitors, security guards, fast food workers, journalists. And I think there are, serious questions to be asked about whether they're being used in overly broad ways. So that's, a proposed rule. We got 26,000 comments. We're currently going through those comments. We actually heard a lot from healthcare workers, including physicians and nurses who are concerned that non-competes are also now, affecting the quality of care because, healthcare workers are stuck in their jobs more and more. So we're looking carefully at those comments, are going to determine, where we land, and then hope to move forward with a finalized rule if we think the record reflects that.
So should non-competes, in your view, just not exist at all, or are there circumstances where it does make sense to have them?
So this is one of the questions that we asked. In our proposed rule, we would have eliminated them in employment contracts. We would have allowed them in contracts where there's a sale of a business. And one of the questions we asked was, if this is overly broad, where should we instead allow non-competes to continue? What are those contexts, be it specific sectors? Is it a specific income level? If it is an income level, what is that level? We also ask questions around, what are alternatives to non-competes that may be more appropriate? So one thing we hear is concerns about trade secrets or intellectual property, where people will say, I don't want to, the reason I have a non-compete is because I don't want my employee to go share all these secrets with my competitor. We do have trade secrets laws, we have non-disclosure agreements, and so one question we asked is, are these alternatives adequate and more appropriate, because you're not also then locking in a worker and preventing them from moving? So those are some of the things we asked about. It'll be interesting to see what we hear.
And what's the time frame for the rule?
So we're going through 26,000 comments. This is non-trivial. So we have a small but mighty team doing that. We're gonna, if we end up finalizing a rule, look to do that as soon as we can.
And then when you're doing this, I assume you're just anticipating kind of legal challenges to it and trying to construct the rules in ways that you think will survive the court. And then do you worry about sort of the ideology of wherever this is going to get filed ending up and then kind of taking your hard work and just decimating it?
Look, we feel very confident that we have the legal authority. The FTC has previously promulgated an unfair method of competition rule. There is DC Circuit precedent on the books saying we have this authority. So, we feel confident that we have this authority. Candidly, we wouldn't have spent the resource putting this rule together if we didn't think we did. We don't have the luxury of just devoting resources to, fantasy projects where we don't have authority. So we feel good about we feel good about that. If we end up facing a challenge in court, we'll explain to the court why we think we have this authority. I do think non-competes is another area where we end up seeing bipartisan concern. We ended up in our record, I believe, getting some comments from folks concerned about religious liberties who wanted to make sure that, if an employee wants to quit because they disagree with their employer's workplace policies, be it relating to vaccine mandates or whatever else there might be, that they should be free to quit and free to quit in a way where they have other employment options. So again, I think this is an area where you can imagine some interesting bedfellows.
So my 16-year-old daughter is a mega Taylor Swift fan. And when I told her we were doing this and I explained what the FTC was, her question is, well, what's she going to do about the whole Ticketmaster mess? And I should disclose I am a StubHub investor, so I'm slightly biased here. But still, what are you going to do about it?
Yeah, so we definitely heard from a lot of Swifties recently around the Ticketmaster debacle. Look, so this was, the merger between Ticketmaster and Live Nation was one that went through around a decade ago. There were concerns raised at that time about how this merger could be bad. One thing that was floated at the time was whether Ticketmaster would be able to use its control over ticketing to really coerce artists into using its venues. Some of the reporting that we've seen since then, suggests that some artists have faced this type of treatment. So, this is something that is in the Justice Department's wheelhouse, the antitrust division there. And so, they may be looking at it, and if they decide to do something, I'm sure there'll be some public interest and support.
Yeah, just a little bit. So you're really young for a position of this much influence and power, and what's it like? I mean, do you basically kind of wake up sometimes, you're like, wait, why are they letting me do all of this? Or is it just one of those, like, someone's got to do it, I'm pretty good at this stuff, I'm just going to plow forward? I mean, kind of just, it's a lot of responsibility for someone your age.
Yeah, look, I mean, it's an enormous honor and privilege to be in this position at this time. And, the fact that this is just an incredibly important moment for the future of antitrust and the future of anti-monopoly is not lost on me. And I'm sure there's a part of me that's kind of just suspended processing all of it in real time. And just at the other end, we'll kind of be like, wow, that was pretty wild. But for now, we're just acting with a lot of urgency to try to move things quickly, try to make sure that the problems that Americans are facing in their day-to-day lives are ones that we're acting quickly to address.
All right, I think it's now time to open it up to the audience. And so Sam and Corey are going to figure out how that happens. What do we do?
And hopefully you will pass the mic to you or just repeat the question for the
Sure.
Hey, Alfred, I know you have one. Are you yourself? Yeah. Here, I can get you a mic.
I think we have a few ringers here.
Hey, how's it going?
Hi.
Oh, sorry, I was not expecting this, but yeah. So in recent cases like Meta and within the FTC has expressed a clear preference for building over buying, and an FTC official recently said one of the goals of the agency's merger enforcement policy is to help steer venture-backed companies to IPOs rather than acquisitions. When reviewing acquisitions of startups, does the agency specifically include in its analysis the ability of a company to go public? And if so, how does it go about that analysis?
Yeah, it's a good question. And, for us as the FTC, this is not about us just making random policy determinations about how we want to see the world or how we want to see business. It's really the laws that Congress passed, right? And so Congress passed laws that say certain types of mergers are illegal. The courts have issued opinions saying that in certain cases, organic growth is preferable to growth through acquisition. And so those are really just the rules on the books that we believe we have to follow. Every merger case is different. Sometimes if we hear arguments from parties, for example, about how their only exit opportunity is this one acquisition by this one company, and yes, it happens to be their biggest rival, those are instances in which we try to vet some of those claims and try to understand, well, what are alternative options? Are there other buyers that the company has engaged? Have they contemplated an IPO? So it really comes up in the context of the claims that the companies make to us rather than kind of a checklist that we go down. But if companies are making claims that this is our one and only exit option, we do try to vet that.
Do I get more than one question or no? It's fine. I don't want to be a hog. So. All right. I don't want a monopoly on the microphone either. So. So the FTC's case against the data broker Kochava was dismissed because the agency didn't sufficiently show that the location data sales were causing substantial harm. But it also did note that an invasion of privacy can meet the standard of harm, under the FTC Act. Is being able to show actual harm compared to theoretically possible examples, as the judge noted in the dismissal, kind of a challenge that the FTC has been having in its privacy cases?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and this is one of our most important privacy cases right now against Kochava, a data broker. We basically brought a case because Kochava was basically making very sensitive geolocation information available online to basically anybody who wanted to access it. And so this was data, about whether people were going to, addiction facilities, religious services, reproductive health services. And so we brought a case saying that, this was an unfair practice. Sorry, I didn't catch your name, but as Alfred asked, we recently got an opinion from the judge where he said, at this stage you didn't survive the motion to dismiss, but you have an opportunity to file the complaint again. And one of the most important things in that opinion was that he acknowledged, I think in the first time in a federal court opinion, that those types of invasions of privacy in and of themselves can be an unfair practice, rather than the invasion of privacy having to lead to, say, your account being hacked or some type of discrimination. So programmatically, that was a really important step forward in terms of privacy law in the United States. The question about injury and how you show it and at what point do you show it, I think is a really interesting one, because the law does allow us to show likelihood of injury rather than injury. And so especially in instances where the worst of the potential nightmare scenarios hasn't actually happened yet, we think it's important for us to be able to go in court and prevent that from happening. And so that's why in this case in particular, we thought it was more important for us to act quickly and protect people from, having their data misused in harmful ways.
Hi, David Jones from Cybersecurity Dive. We've been covering a couple of very interesting cases that the FTC has gotten involved in regarding data security and how companies manage the security of their customers and notification and governance and things like that. Wanted to ask, how does the FTC view the future of kind of making sure that customers are brought into the loop in a prompt way when their data is potentially breached or ransomed? And what kind of standards are you holding companies in terms of how they notify federal agencies, manage that data? I'm sure you recall the recent case involving the former chief security officer at Uber, which was a very controversial case in the security industry, but kind of set a new precedent in a sense. Can you talk about where you're headed in that direction?
Yeah, so data security is a really important part of our work, especially as more and more of the economy digitizes and a lot of very sensitive information is online. We think it's really important that companies are investing in ensuring that data is secure. One of the things that we've been doing recently is really making sure that in our enforcement actions and the relief that we mandate, the companies are making sure that they're following best practices in data security, right? I mean, this is a field that is rapidly changing. You know, best practices tomorrow might not be what they were a year ago. And so our orders have been requiring companies to, for example, you know, include multi-factor authentication and really reflect the best practices of data security specialists. We've also been looking closely at, you know, where can we be encouraging more companies to abide by the law in the first instance. One of the things we've done is hold individual executives liable when we thought that they were, you know, involved in or overseeing or sufficiently participating in the illegal practice. So one of the data security cases we brought was against Drizzly. And there we did hold a high-level executive accountable because, you know, several of these issues were brought to his attention and he didn't act. So that type of individual liability we think is also important to make sure that companies are fully getting the message.
And just a quick follow-up. Right now, most of the enforcement historically has been on a state-by-state level where you have state AGs kind of enforcing, and sometimes they group together to go after a particular company where consumers in different states are impacted. Is there a need, in your view, for a federal data privacy legislation that would nationalize data security in that regard?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think if Congress passed strong federal privacy law, that would be a good thing and make sure that all Americans have minimum privacy rights. I think a lot of the work that states have been doing to make sure their own citizens are protected is really important. And so I would want to make sure that any federal privacy law is a floor rather than the ceiling. And if specific states want to go on and protect their citizens even more, that they're able to do so.
Any other questions? Sam? Here, wait, Sam.
Sam Sutton, Politico. There have been a lot of iBankers and deal makers who said the agency's showing of its teeth, you know, a bit more in recent years has pushed them away from doing deals that, you know, you might not personally view as viable. Do you view that as a marker of success for the FTC? And if so, I mean, we're in New York. What's it like making that case to those iBankers and those deal makers?
So look, as a law enforcer, one of your goals has to be deterrence, right? You want to prevent illegal practices from happening in the first place. Unfortunately, I think in recent decades, there had been a trend where deals were getting out of the boardroom that were facially anti-competitive. And if now we're at a stage where there are discussions happening in the boardroom that are preventing those deals from actually seeing the light of day, I think that's a good thing. I think illegal deals should not be proposed in the first instance. Just to step back, in any given year, we get anywhere from 1,500 to, in very high volume years, 3,000 merger filings. Really, if you look at the numbers, a relatively small fraction of those even get a second look, an even smaller fraction are ultimately challenged. So there's still a lot of deal making that's happening. I think if there's any chilling happening, again, of the biggest company in a market buying his biggest competitor, I think that type of deterrence can be a positive.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hey there, Frida Polly, Chief Data Science Officer of Harvard. So I agree with you that we do have existing laws on the books for many of these things. I do think that as a technologist who's built around employment law that was created in 1968, there are meaningful gaps that I think need closing. So one of the questions I have is, since the EU, for example, has sort of taken a lead in trying to create regulation around AI with the EU AI Act and whatnot, do you worry at all that taking the position that, hey, there are these existing laws, they're fine for now, we might cede kind of prominence to other jurisdictions, which at the end of the day, whether I build my technology in New York or somewhere else, I still have to comply with GDPR and other laws coming out of the EU. So I'm just curious on your thoughts around that.
Yeah, look, I think it's incredibly important for lawmakers to be thinking about what new laws might be necessary. Really, my point has been that, like, let's not, until we get those new laws, let's not pretend that no new current laws apply, because I do think that some of the statements we hear suggest that there is this current regulatory vacuum. But I think you're absolutely right that we need to be thinking about what is the right framework for these, for some of these new rules? What types of, requirements do we want to be imposing on what these companies need to be even vetting for before these things come out into the wild, right? I think one thing that I'm concerned about is whether it's the public and under-resourced enforcement agencies, under-resourced civil service society, groups, under-resourced academics that are going to have to do the cleanup, when it's the companies that have the relevant information, they have the relevant resources to ensure some safety and cleanliness on the front end, rather than allowing these tools out into the wild and then expecting everybody else to do the cleanup. So I think that's what we need to be looking out for as well.
Thank you. Max Bodek with Foundation for American Innovation. It's a DC think tank. We've done a lot of work on boosting science and technical capacity at regulatory agencies, including the FTC. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the specific capacity improvements you'd like to see, like appropriations requests that would be really helpful for you guys, and yeah, just kind of how you see the landscape going forward, especially as fiscal austerity begins to kick in on like the right of center.
Yeah, it's a really important question, and ensuring that the FTC has the necessary technological capacity has definitely been a top priority. The FTC has had, technologists at the agency for upward of a decade, but we really thought there was an opportunity to scale there. So a couple of months ago, we launched a new Office of Technology. We have a Chief Technology Officer. They're hiring just within a week of putting out their notices. They got somewhere around 500 applications from very off the charts qualified people. So we're really encouraged and are bringing on data scientists, data engineers, AI specialists, specialists in data security. So that's definitely an area where we're building, but there's a lot more need. We were lucky and we got a boost from Congress this past year. So we'll be able to hire 150 new people, which when you're an agency of 1,200 is non-trivial. So we're really excited about that. But again, I think we're still a fraction of the size we need to be, given how big a job and how important a job Congress has given us. So any support for more appropriations is definitely welcome.
All right, we have time for one more question, Henry. Actually, what you got there? All right.
We can do two if that's helpful.
All right, great.
Hi, Sameepa Shetty, not from a think tank, but from CNBC. I'm more curious about your thoughts and how you're viewing this world going forward, especially as data becomes the key cornerstone of future fights as we step into this world of AI. I'm keen to know from a consumer and from a company's point of view, who has data ownership? Is it the platform that I submit my data to, or is it me as an individual that I have ownership of my data? Because as we're seeing the world unfold around us, all of the information that platforms have, all of the data that platforms have, are going to be fed continually into these algorithms and then spit out generative artificial intelligence. And give it a few more years, we might not know what the origin and genesis and thesis of this is. So I'm curious to see how you are thinking through these potential future problems and what your mental makeup is there.
Yeah, it's a good question, and one that a lot of folks have been grappling with for some time, right? Because we've already seen for the last couple of decades all sorts of business models that are premised on monetizing personal data. You're right that AI is going to basically turbocharge that in terms of scraping the entire web to be feeding your models and algorithms. I think is already leading to questions from creators in particular about what it's going to look like for them. Are they going to get compensation for their content if it's being fed into these models? I think there are a lot of really important questions there. As of right now, we don't have some type of kind of personal property regime with that type of data. I think we have seen some legislative proposals trying to codify that sort of thing. At the FTC, we're really focused on making sure that people have choice and they are fully aware of how companies are going to be using their data. Some of the privacy enforcement actions that we brought recently have been in the context of health apps. where, especially during the pandemic, we saw a proliferation of health apps, and some of them have been collecting personal data for the purpose of providing health services, but then turning around and quietly also selling that data or making it available for advertising in ways that, especially when you're talking about, counseling apps or, mental health data. I mean, this is really, really sensitive stuff. And so at the very least, we want to make sure that users and consumers are not being deceived about how this data is being used. I think some of the more interesting property right questions that you're raising is probably going to be figured out by Congress.
All right, I promise to get her out because you guys can always keep asking questions for like 3 more hours. So thank you so much for coming and for
Thank you
doing
so
this.
much.
We're really grateful.
Thank you.